Welcome to Study Session 10. Marxism, Origins, Sources, and General Legacy of Marx. Introduction. This study session will examine the origin and sources of Marxism, that body of knowledge that Karl Marx bestowed on the world in the 19th century. The study session will discuss the general aspects of Marx's legacy with regard to specific areas of academic interest. When you have studied this session, you should be able to define and use correctly the keywords printed in bold letters. Describe the context in which Marx began to write what later became known as Marxism. Describe the context in which Marx began to write what later became known as Marxism. Outline the various sources from which Marx drew his material. Identify the general legacy that Marx left behind as a philosopher. And outline Marx's contribution to the study of economics, sociology, philosophy, and politics. You might wonder why we have to give this special study session on Marxism, especially in the wake of the last study session which focused on socialism. The reason is quite simple. While it is true that there is a brand of socialism, namely scientific socialism, often associated with Karl Marx, most of Karl Marx's works cannot be subsumed under that brand of socialism. He developed another body of ideas which, though not contradictory to his contributions to socialism, was far beyond. It is this other body of ideas that we now call Marxism after Marx, the originator. Like several other political ideas that emerged in the 19th century, Marxism emerged out of Karl Marx's attempt to make sense of the capitalist society that had emerged out of the Industrial Revolution. The Industrial Revolution had created a situation in which production could go on at a pace hitherto unmatched, thus creating the possibility of banishing poverty once and for all. Ironically, however, this same revolution had created a society in which economic and social hardships and political repression not only persisted but worsened. It was all this that prompted Marx to want to study the logic of industrialization and capitalism. We are sure that you have noted, therefore, that the newly emerging industrial society of the 1840s to the 1980s formed the historical and social context in which Marx, a German, wrote until his death in 1883. This new industrial society had emerged following the Industrial Revolution from the ashes of feudal society. Industrialization had created new classes in the form of the bourgeoisie, that is, the owners of capital used in industrial production, as against the nobility of the feudal era, whose wealth was in land, and the proletariat, that is, the working class who worked in the factory as wage earners, as against the serfs who, under feudalism, lived off land rented to them by the nobility. The new material forces, that is, industrialization and the attendant urbanization, the creation of bourgeois and working classes, undermined feudalism, and in the process transformed feudal society into capitalist society. The transformation throughout Europe took either of two forms. In those areas in which the monarchs and feudal lords were not ready to make concessions to the new forces, the change was violent. It took the form of the 1789 French Revolution and the Napoleonic Wars up to about 1812. In countries where the monarchs and the feudal lords were ready to make gradual concessions, the change was largely peaceful. An example was Britain, where there was a gradual extension of the franchise to the lower classes. In trying to understand this transition from feudal to capitalist society and then study the emergent capitalist society, Marx drew material inspiration from at least three sources, namely French political thinkers, especially Rousseau, several political economists, especially Adam Smith and David Ricardo, and Hegel's political philosophy. From Rousseau, Marx borrowed the idea that the purpose of government was to articulate and realize the general will of the people. Much of the data detailing the economic and social aspect of the rise and essence of capitalism had earlier been unearthed in detailed studies by political economists like Smith and Ricardo. From Hegel, Marx had borrowed the methodology of the dialectic. This was a method in which change was seen as occurring as a result of the resolution of the conflicts between two opposing forces. Thus, at the initial stage, you have a thesis which then leads to the opposite, an antithesis. The conflict between thesis and antithesis is then resolved at a higher stage of development when a synthesis emerges. Shortly after, at this higher stage, a new thesis emerges, followed by another antithesis, and then another resolution in another synthesis, and so on. In his analysis of the origin of capitalism, for instance, he saw capitalism as having emerged from a conflict between the landed aristocracy and feudal society and the new bourgeois class. These are the three basic sources from which Marx derived his initial data and inspiration. The picture of man that emerges from his work is threefold. That is, man is a product of his environment. Man is also a creator of his environment, and man is conscious. He not only acts, but is aware that he is acting. Within the context of his view about the future of man, we can separate two levels in the works of Marx, namely, historical inevitability. This relates to the argument that man will inevitably seek to bring about a classless communist society, which will be better than any pre-existing society. Social desirability. According to him, communist society is desirable because it will enable all men to develop freely their individual and social capacities. Against this background, we will outline to you the general aspect of the legacy that Marx left behind in the next session. The general legacy of Karl Marx. The Marxism that Marx left behind can be divided into two, namely, Marxism as an ideology, the religion of the oppressed, and as a call to revolutionary action to overthrow an unjust system, and Marxism as a scientific and profound academic tool for the study of political, economic, and social issues. In this session and the next, we will concentrate on the second sense of Marxism as a scientific body of ideas. In a general sense, what Marx does is to outline the relationship among several aspects of society. In doing this, he emphasizes the importance of material factors and forces. He outlines what he calls relations of production. According to him, this refers to the way men organize their production. The relations of production, along with the forces of production, constitute the real basis of society. You should know that Marx believes that it is on material basis, instruments of production, that elements which he calls legal and political superstructures are built. In other words, according to Marx, political, legal, and intellectual life is influenced by how men earn their living. Having established this relationship, Marx then shows how society changes as a result of conflict between relations of production and forces of production. At one stage of human development in any particular epoch, according to him, the relations of production become a shackle to the further development of the forces of production. In other words, the productivity and development of the instruments of production is hindered by the manner in which production is organized. At this stage, a revolutionary situation is created. What Marx then does is to trace the development of human society against the background of this dialectic. In this, he outlines the stages of development of various historical eras, from the first era of primitive communism to slave society, through feudalism to the contemporary era of bourgeois society. He then identifies bourgeois society as a final stage of divided society. According to him, the society will end in a revolution which will usher in a classless communist society after an initial period of the dictatorship of the proletariat or the working class. Other legacies of Marx. In this section, we will examine the legacy that Marx left behind in four specific areas of analysis, namely economic thought, sociology, philosophy, politics. Legacy in economic thought. Here, Marx made two specific contributions. One, he propounded the labor theory of value, and two, he gave a concise analysis of the origin and dynamics of capitalism. In the labor theory of value, Marx sought to identify the value of a product with the value of labor expended on its production. With regard to his analysis of capitalism, it is wrong to say that Marx was anti-capitalist in the sense that he saw capitalism was to a large extent a positive thing. For him, capitalism had made possible the emergence of greater productive forces than man had ever before experienced. For this reason, Marx saw capitalism as a revolutionary force which had made it possible to create abundance and abolish poverty and wretchedness once and for all. However, Marx saw the need to transcend capitalism and move on to a higher state of political organization, which he called communism. For him, therefore, economic systems were neither natural nor eternal. Rather, they gave way to others according to some laws. Thus, he was very clear on the point that the collapse of the capitalist system was inevitable. However, he was not clear on several other questions, such as how would all societies first have to become capitalist before they become communist? There is no doubt that Marx paid very little attention to non-capitalist societies in his writings. This is not surprising, since the major focus of his study was a capitalist mode of production. What he did contribute to economic analysis was a method that insisted that bourgeois economics and its laws were neither eternal, infallible, nor the highest level of human development that man could attain. A very important legacy of Marx in the area of sociological analysis is his class analysis. It is true, of course, that Marx failed to present a coherent definition of class in his analysis. However, he did identify certain criteria that could be used in determining an individual's location in the class structure of society. These criteria include 1. The individual's location within the mode of production, that is, whether he belongs to the class of owners of capital or the means of production, or to a class of non-owners of capital who live by selling their wage labor. And 2. The consciousness of an individual that he belongs to one particular class. In other words, the individual must not just belong to a class by definition, but he must be aware that he belongs to that class. Marx thus distinguished between two types of classes, a class in itself and a class for itself. For him, it is not the demographic fact of being a member of a class in itself that creates real classes in society. Rather, it is the process of an individual being aware of his class situation that creates a class for itself and thus a revolutionary situation. As he puts it in a lengthy statement in his 18th Brumaire of Louis Bonaparte, insofar as millions of families live under economic conditions of existence that separate their mode of life, their interest and their culture from those of the other classes, and put them in hostile opposition to the latter, they form a class. Insofar as there is merely a local interconnection among those small-holding peasants, and the identification of their interest begets no community, no national bond, and no political organization among them, they do not form a class. They are consequently incapable of enforcing their class interest in their own name. Now, you might want to ask, in what specific areas did Marx make specific contributions to class analysis? Definitely, it was not Marx that discovered either the existence of class or class struggle in modern society. Several historians and economists before him had done this. Marx's specific contributions include the following. 1. In defining classes, he used the individual's location within the mode of production and introduced the element of consciousness. In this, he discarded with existing practice of using indices such as income, style of living, status, education, and occupation. 2. He showed that particular classes were linked to particular historical periods in the development of production. While there were no classes or division of labor under primitive communism, for instance, the nobility and serfs were two classes specific to feudal society, while the bourgeoisie and the proletariat were specific to capitalists. 3. He saw in the class struggle the agent of change from one particular epoch to a higher one. While it was a conflict between relations and forces of production that created the opportunity for change, such an opportunity had to be seized by human beings acting within the framework of the class struggle, according to Marx. The class struggle will continue until a classless communist society, the highest form of human development, had been reached. In at least two important areas, Marx's class analysis has drawn some criticism. First, he is said to have underestimated the ability of capitalist society to ensure that the class struggle did not degenerate into a level that would threaten the society and lead to communist society. Second, he is again accused of having dealt essentially with classes in contemporary capitalist systems to the utter neglect of non-capitalist societies. Legacy in philosophy. We can talk of two areas in which Marx contributed to philosophy. First, in a negative sense, and second, in a positive sense. Marx argued against philosophy, accusing it of raising questions and issues of an ideal nature. Instead, he substituted a philosophy which he felt was more scientific and positivist. This was the philosophy of the dialectic which was mentioned earlier. Legacy in politics. Marx wrote every illuminating analysis of contemporaneous events in the Europe of his time. Beyond this, however, he failed to develop a systematic theory of politics comparable to his legacy in the area of economics. Nevertheless, his notion of politics is clear enough. For him, political power is the organized power of one class for oppressing another. In fact, Marx believed that the state emerged following the emergence of classes in society. In other words, without classes, there would be no need for a state. As he puts it, a society without classes is a society with no need for a state. In such classless society as the proposed communist society, therefore, there will no longer be any political poser, because political poser is precisely the official expression of antagonism in civil society. In comparing this new perspective with others, Ralph Miliband, in his Marxism and Politics, argues that at the core of Marxist politics, there is the notion of conflict. But this is not what makes it specific and distinct. All concepts of politics are about conflict. Conflict is functional, a stabilizing rather than a disruptive force. According to him, therefore, the Marxism conflict is not a matter of problems to be solved, but of a state of domination and subjection to be ended by a total transformation of the conditions which give rise to it. The antagonists are irreconcilable. Study session summary. This study session examined the origin and development of Marxism. It also discusses the legacies in the areas of scientific analysis of economic, social, and philosophical and political issues. We have now come to the end of Studies Session 10 and to the end of the course POS212